Alright, everyone, let's take a look at these three statements. The first statement says this flower smells good. The second statement says this flower is a reproductive organ of a specific plant, and the third statement says this flower is beautiful. Three different statements. Let's discuss them here. Now, for the first statement, can we expect it to apply universally? We have all sorts of perfumes, right? They're all labeled as perfumes. But here's the thing, I later learned that there are some perfumes that smell awful, but some people actually find them pleasant, you know? It's a personal and subjective judgment based on individual preferences. No doubt about it. It stimulates our sense of smell, and we perceive a certain fragrance. We express whether it pleases us or not, but it may not have the same effect on everyone. Is that possible? Absolutely. This also applies to taste, right? Our taste buds on our tongues get stimulated when we eat different foods. Take stinky tofu, for instance. It stimulates our taste buds in a unique way. This taste sensation can be subjective, varying from person to person. It can even be influenced by cultural traditions. You get the picture, right? It has its nuances. There's an objective factor, but it doesn't necessarily mean it applies universally. For example, the pollen from certain flowers stimulates our sense of smell, and there's a reason behind it. It's not subjective, there's an actual fragrance. We can definitely smell it. There's an objective factor, but it doesn't equate to universality. So, strictly speaking, the first statement, inaccurately expressed, should be referred to as a sensory judgment, you know? But this type of judgment can't be expected to have unanimous agreement. So, strictly speaking, it's not really a judgment, we need to use quotation marks. From a logical perspective, what do we need every time we make a judgment? Universal agreement, right? Otherwise, we shouldn't make any claims. Take, for instance, the temperature of water. Is it hot or not hot enough? Just put your hand under the faucet, and you can feel it, right? When you turn on the faucet, one person might say the water isn't hot enough, while another person who goes to take a shower might say it's too hot. It's all subjective. One person says it's not hot enough, the other says it's too hot. Who's right? There's no absolute truth. If you want to find the truth, there's only one way to do it: specify the temperature of the water. That's the only way, and there's no way to debate that, right? It's not about universal agreement. So now, let's say the temperature of the water is 35 degrees. Is that a judgment? Yes, it is. It requires universal agreement, and you can't disagree with it unless you measure it yourself. The second judgment needs everyone to agree on it because it's a scientific judgment. In the study of plants, we discuss the process of flowering and what exactly the flower is. It's not something you smell, right? It's not about aesthetics either, it's simply a part of the plant's reproductive system. Once you dive into the realm of botany, you learn a bunch of fundamental concepts that come together to form this judgment. This judgment requires a unanimous decision and holds universal importance. All flowers are reproductive organs of plants, and this judgment is grounded in rational scientific concepts. You can call it a rational judgment for simplicity's sake. Oh, and we can't put quotation marks around the word judgment here because it's a genuine and essential judgment, you know, with all the necessity and universality it encompasses. Is there any doubt about this? Well, there shouldn't be. This judgment is rooted in rational concepts like reproductive organs, which are fundamental to the study of botany. If you're not into botany, this judgment may not directly apply to you, but that doesn't mean you can reject it. Once you delve into botany, it'll all make sense. So yeah, this judgment is something we must all accept. Now let's consider a third type of judgment: this flower is beautiful. Here, the predicate beautiful is firmly grounded in the domain of sensory experience, is it not? This predicate is not a rational concept. After all, you can only say a flower is beautiful if you have seen it. It is inextricably linked to sensory perception. But can we equate this third type of judgment with the first type? Let's put that third judgment in quotes: this flower is beautiful. What does that mean? When you say, this flower is beautiful, what exactly are you saying? You are essentially saying, this flower is beautiful to me. It's similar to the first statement: this flower is fragrant. That statement implicitly means, this flower is fragrant to me. Can you not also say, this flower is beautiful to me, in the same way? If you examine it that way, this statement seems quite absurd, doesn't it? The statement, this flower is fragrant to me, is not at all absurd, it is perfectly valid. But, this flower is beautiful to me, is extremely absurd and problematic. It immediately raises suspicions. You see, in the realm of aesthetics, we encounter individual differences, don't we? So if we cling to these individual differences in aesthetic judgment, we will inevitably equate this third type of judgment with the first type. And once we make that equation, we arrive back at the implications I described earlier. In the world of art and beauty, we're open to all kinds of discussions and critiques. Artists are free to pursue their creative vision, and it doesn't matter how you feel about it. I painted this piece for myself, and it's beautiful to me. It doesn't matter if you all criticize it, it's still beautiful. I made it for myself, so what's there to discuss? But let's face it, in the world of art and beauty, we're all making judgments for others. This statement isn't just about my own judgment, but about a judgment for all of humanity. I said this piece is beautiful, and it needs to be agreed upon by everyone. But then I found that some people disagree, and that's okay, we can talk about it. But the intention behind my judgment is crystal clear: it's about the universal nature of feelings. This is a judgment about the universal nature of feelings. In fact, what do we usually call this kind of judgment? It's what we refer to as aesthetic judgment. Aesthetic judgment is about the universal nature of feelings, not about the particular or individual aspects of feelings. The first kind of judgment is about the particular and unique aspects of feelings. In fact, it's not really a judgment. Now we're delving into philosophical thinking, and I know that everyone will continue to have doubts. My years of experience teaching art philosophy have taught me that we need to downplay the emphasis on the universality of aesthetic judgment in the field of aesthetics. We're definitely going to raise some eyebrows. It's clear that there are so many individual differences in the field of aesthetics. You might listen to the same piece of music and think, wow, this is amazing, while someone else might not be moved at all. They might wonder what's so great about it. Let's discuss it. Individual differences definitely exist. So, you know that painting by Van Gogh, the one called Sunflowers. It's in the National Gallery in the UK, and loads of people walk past it every year, right? Everyone just assumes it's this amazing piece of art, right? But then they stroll by and think, is that all there is to it? Why is it considered so great? When we think about this, we see aesthetics as something personal and subjective. We can't figure out how some folks can force their aesthetic judgment on all of us. When someone says that Van Gogh's work is great, we can't really argue because it's seen as authoritative. If that's the case, then there's no point in discussing art philosophy. The value of Van Gogh's painting is definitely undeniable, but you can't just see it at first glance, right? And it doesn't mean that when he created it, everyone immediately recognized its worth. The example of Van Gogh really highlights this issue, doesn't it? He wasn't famous during his lifetime and mostly relied on his brother for support. When he passed away, he never imagined that his work would become so valuable, right? He went beyond his time. Yes. It was only appreciated by later generations, and the history of art suggests that the objectivity of beauty is up for debate, right? If it's objective, then his peers should have recognized his greatness right away. Why did only a few people discover it? This is a big issue that art philosophy will delve into, but it's still a bit early to talk about it. Many historical events in art history and our individual aesthetic experiences show that beauty is always relative. Looked at it this way, it's all about relativism. For instance, different ethnic groups have significant differences in their appreciation of each other's artistic works. But no matter how different, our great works of art are always initially appreciated within an ethnic group. And if it's great, it becomes global. This is also a fact in art history, right? Otherwise, Beethoven's music would only be confined to the ears of Germans and Austrians. Beethoven's music is blasting through concert halls all over the world, keeping us fired up to join the quest for truth. When we're stuck in the thick of tough times, not knowing where we're headed, we turn to Beethoven's symphonies once more. We realize that Beethoven is one of us, tackling the issues of our time. The accuracy of each interpretation depends on the conductor, so leading an orchestra is a big deal. It's not just about skill, it's about guiding us. He aims to have Beethoven once again guide us through the complexities of modern life and help us find the answers we need. The conductors are not just great at waving their batons, they're also like philosophers. The ordinary conductor is just a tool to keep the orchestra in line. We can't let the performance of this piece fall apart at the end, we've got to maintain that flow. It's essential, the bare minimum to do. Because every symphony, from the first note to the last, is like a continuous thread. What's woven into this thread? What kind of tension is it? Once that tension eases up, it's game over. Who's the one pulling this thread? The conductor. That's the conductor's first job, but if that's all you do, you're not a true conductor. You've got to take this piece from the sheet music and bring it into the hearts of today's audience, and when it is in their hearts, you've got to make it speak to today's issues. There are 1,000 conductors, there are 1,000 Beethovens. With our conductors today, what do we have? Beethoven. It's like he's right here with us. This is just one example I use to show that the world of beauty is an objective world, a world of truth. We gotta back up our argument with some solid logic. But man, it's tough. Backing up a claim like this. Saying that this passage is beautiful is not just a matter of personal taste, it's a deep emotional and aesthetic judgment. It's a real challenge to prove this point, like, really tough. So, where's the real struggle here? Imagine there's a painting hanging on the blackboard, just go with me on this. I'm digging the painting, and some of you are checking it out too. Some folks are into it, while others are like, meh. So, as one of the fans, I'm like, how can you not appreciate this awesome piece of art? Do you even know how incredibly beautiful it is? And you're like, I don't know. Well, if you don't know, let me break it down for you. I start explaining the painting's creative techniques, its major breakthroughs in art history, its composition, use of color, color contrasts, and the overall vibe of the lines. I lay it all out for you. After hearing me out, you might be like, wow, this is truly an impressive work of art. You might acknowledge it, but still not feel it, right? I've given you all the logical reasons why this painting is amazing. The arguments are crystal clear. You can't really argue against them. You might agree with me on the surface, but still not feel the beauty deep down, right? So, where's the problem? Beauty isn't something you can just break down with logic. It's universal, but it doesn't follow the rules of logic. No matter how you explain a piece of art, it might not click with someone as beautiful. Even if you're totally into it, you can't use logic to explain why you find it beautiful. Kant really nailed this idea. He talked about the third kind of judgment, called aesthetic judgment, and it's not something you can just put in quotes. It's all about getting everyone on board. It's not like saying, to me, this flower is beautiful. Nope, it's about it being beautiful to everyone. It's not just my take, it's a universal judgment, and it's not based on concepts, you know? If this judgment, aesthetic judgment, were based on concepts, then all my explanations of this work should eventually make you feel its beauty. Beauty doesn't rely on concepts, right? If it did, it would be something you could explain and analyze logically. But beauty doesn't play by those rules. Because it doesn't fit into logical analysis, we tend to think it's all about personal opinion. But no, it's still something that's objective and applies to everyone. So, we're dealing with a pretty cool thing here, a big deal in human civilization, this universality and objectivity that doesn't rely on concepts. It's all about feelings, but it's still something that applies to everyone and is objective. We're facing this incredible human aesthetic phenomenon, an artistic phenomenon. Understanding this phenomenon is a whole field of study. This field was established relatively late and is called aesthetics. You know, ancient thoughts on aesthetics have been around for ages, in both China and the West. So, Socrates once had this chat with someone about what beauty really is. And after going back and forth, they both agreed that beauty is tough, like really tough. In the end, Socrates had to admit that it's just impossible to explain beauty through theory. It was a pretty big deal, a real breakthrough. Beauty isn't something you can study theoretically or explain logically, but we all know it's universal. So, we've stepped into this cool field of study, now called philosophy of art, but it used to be called aesthetics. Why is it so interesting? Well, because we're dealing with beauty and art which are objective and universal, but they don't play by the rules of logical analysis and theoretical explanation, because they're not based on concepts. So here, Kant made a very important contribution. He said, we can have a kind of perception, which is in itself a judgment, called aesthetic judgment. This kind of perception as judgment is the sense of beauty. You can never use rational methods to make others agree with your aesthetic judgment of a particular object. As I mentioned earlier, you can't use rational methods to make others agree with your aesthetic judgment of a particular object. Also, this aesthetic judgment is not particular only to you as an individual, that's not the case. Then, Kant went on. For example, the first judgment, the first kind of judgment, what is it? It expresses a kind of pleasure, right? It's pleasant. So he said, he first feels pleasure, and then he says it's pleasant, he judges it. That's called first pleasure, and judgment arises from pleasure. He said the third kind is the other way around, pleasure arises from judgment, and that's what aesthetic sense is. But the pleasure that arises from judgment is not logical judgment, right? It's not scientific judgment, it's not rational judgment, it's not based on concepts, but it's still a judgment. And pleasure is derived from this judgment. We also need to clarify another issue, that the relationship between judgment and the resulting pleasure is not one of temporal precedence, of cause and effect. If we only understand the causal relationship, the practical sequence of prior cause and subsequent effect, then we are still some distance from true philosophical understanding. This judgment precedes the feeling of pleasure, but this precedence is based on logical priority, not temporal priority. What do I mean by logical priority? This gets into deeper philosophical considerations. For example, take the relationship between the sun and sunlight. It is undoubtedly a causal relationship, with sunlight being the result of the sun. The sun is the cause, sunlight the effect. But does this causal relationship have a temporal sequence? No, it does not. You could not call something a sun if it did not emit light, did not radiate illumination. It's not as if there was first some non-luminous thing, which then eventually started giving off light. No, the causal relationship between the sun and sunlight is not one of temporal priority, but of logical priority. We can never perceive the sun itself directly, we only ever experience the sunlight. It is the sunlight that allows us to confirm the existence of the sun. Fascinating, isn't it? Later, Chinese thinkers came to understand this type of relationship, expressing it in Buddhist concepts like the relationship between substance and function. This substance-function relationship is not one where substance precedes function in time. There is no temporal priority here, the priority is one of logical foundation. It is the substance that provides the basis for the function. There is no sequence, no prior and posterior, it is a type of causal relationship I described earlier as one of logical priority. Grasping this mode of thinking is extremely important for truly understanding the world. This way of viewing relationships is profoundly significant. If aesthetics is a fact, what is the basis for this fact? The basis, given the vast subjective differences, cannot be something like taste or smell. No, it must have an objective basis. What did Kant see as this objective basis? Kant posited that human perception of external things has a kind of a priori common sense. This a priori common sense is what is shared between people, it is not formed through experience, but is a priori. This a priori common sense is the basis for aesthetic judgment and the facts of aesthetics. When this common sense is applied, it yields many aesthetic judgments. Kant's critique of judgment is the third part of his major works, following the critique of pure reason and the critique of practical reason. In the critique of judgment, the topic he addresses is aesthetic judgment. This faculty is the central theme of his third great critique. The first critique addressed the question of how objective, reliable knowledge of external things is possible. The second critique answered how human freedom and the good are possible. The third critique seeks to answer how beauty is possible. Not whether it is possible, since it is a fact, but how it is possible. The three critiques can be summarized in 3 words: truth, goodness, and beauty. So the third critique addresses the basis of beauty. What is the basis for something being considered beautiful? Kant says that in an aesthetic judgment, there is a pleasure that arises in the senses. But this pleasure arises from the judgment itself. There are 2 types of judgments, one where the pleasure comes first and then the judgment, this flower smells nice, and one where the judgment comes first and then the pleasure, this is a beautiful flower. But in both cases, the basis is not temporal priority, but logical priority. We apply our a priori common sense to the object, and if it aligns, we judge it to be beautiful, as if all of humanity is collectively judging that particular thing.